Hey guys, welcome to Make Money Count. Back for another week. I wasn't on the podcast last week, but I would like to say in front of everybody that I do think that I could win the Nobel Prize. And a member of my family also won the Order of Canada. So there you go. I'm halfway there, I think.
You think you can win the Nobel Prize?
Yeah.
All right. For what?
Confident. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Hopefully by the end of this podcast. Today, we're going to talk about a really big issue that Canada has that we're both worried about, and most Canadians should be worried about. Bank of Canada was worried about it too. Everybody's worried about it. Productivity. So,
So we are going to go through today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about Canada's productivity problem. Who says we have a productivity problem? Then we're going to talk about what productivity is. What does it mean to have an issue with productivity? And then we're going to explain what is affecting our productivity and hopefully what things we can do to claw our way back from the productivity hole we find ourselves in. And then we're going to kind of compare ourselves to the United States, which I'm going to tell you something.
it's not good.
It's not going to look good. And then at the end, I'm going to tell you why I think we are where we are. Also not good. But to start off, we've got a problem. So the Bank of Canada says we have a problem. I mean, just the other day, Tiff Macklin, and this is a problem in and of itself. Just the other day, Tiff Macklin in a press conference said, it seems as though monetary policy in Canada is gaining more traction than it is in the United States.
Right.
You know how concerning that is? Monetary policy is going to have a greater impact in Canada than it ever will in the United States because Canadians have 5-year mortgage terms. So every single year, 20% of mortgages are going to naturally come up for renewal and be exposed to higher interest rates. Whereas in the United States, people will pull back from moving or from refinancing in favor of maintaining the interest rate on their mortgage in the period of
25, 30 years.
Yeah, well, in the period of when rates are going up.
Right.
Inflationary periods. So that kind of contracts. And then when the rates come back down again, that business comes back to the marketplace. In Canada, Canadians get hit with that every single year, 20% of Canadians, roughly. So the Bank of Canada, though, the article there is Carolyn Rogers, the deputy governor, spoke at an event and outlined Canada's productivity problem. Austin's got it up here. And we're going to discuss exactly why Canada has a productivity problem. This is just to say that the Bank of Canada is noting it. They're telling us about it. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce, another article, are telling us about it. And they're trying to offer some suggestions as to what can happen within the economy to help stimulate some productivity.
If you're going to read this as a listener or read some of those as a listener, that the Chamber of Commerce one was my favorite.
Yeah. Basically, it's telling us that we need to find a way to stimulate small businesses into growth or motivate larger businesses to become more competitive.
Right.
And I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. The problem with getting large businesses, the largest of Canadian businesses, to try to become more competitive, it doesn't work when they're oligopolies.
Right.
Oligopolies by nature don't have to be competitive.
Right.
Because all they do is collude with the other parties that control that sector of the economy in order to avoid having to be competitive because there's nobody competing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Rogers, Bell.
Tell us.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
That's for what? Telecommunications?
Yeah. I'm just saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What about groceries?
Right.
What about banking?
Yeah.
What about media? Every single big industry in Canada, airlines, is dominated by oligopolies, preventing them from even having to become innovative. It's a problem. RBC calls it out in their recent thought leadership document. Every single Canadian bank is calling the alarm bells. The longer you look for people talking about productivity in Canada, the more you're going to find about people ringing the alarm bell.
Right.
And you know what? It's a problem.
They should be ringing it.
Okay, so pull up this chart. We want to see how much of a problem it is. Productivity, labor productivity in 2021, okay? It's only gotten worse because of immigration, right? Productivity is the amount of output. Oh, this is a spoiler because I said I was going to say it afterwards.
Yeah.
But it's basically the amount of GDP output, the amount of income per capita that's being generated. Each person, each unit of labor in the labor force, what are they producing and contributing? How can you make them produce more? How can you make them work less and make more.
Right.
Right? That's the way you got to think about productivity. Making every unit of labor more potent within our economy. And that helps everybody. The way to dilute it is to dump in a whole bunch of unskilled workers, thereby having more workers produce the same, if not less, output.
Right.
Right? Reduces it. Anyways, here, why do we have a problem? Why do we have a problem? Okay, like let's look at the comparison. Please bear with me, because when I get to the next part where we're going to talk about exactly why we have a problem, it's going to get really, really interesting. Really interesting. But this, in and of itself, this chart showing labor productivity only up until 2021 pegs us after Italy, after Australia, after Finland, after Iceland, after the Netherlands. We are doing abysmally, and I guarantee you it's worse now than it was when this was produced. And this is GDP per hour worked, right? The amount of gross domestic productivity allocated to each hour of an employee working. It's so scary, that chart. Okay, what is productivity? I guess we kind of said that already.
A little bit, but
I pulled an article that has like the StatsCan definition of productivity. Listen, productivity is a measure of how potent your workers are.
right.
How little they need to work in order to produce a unit of income for the country.
Right.
And we just saw that, right? 1 hour worked, the amount of GDP that it brings in relative to a whole bunch of different countries. When you're not productive, you pay for it. And you don't just pay for it in, a long, slow, sluggish economy. That, by the way, is going to need far more rate cuts. If you're going to take one thing away from today, because obviously it's a fucking podcast and we're not going to solve Canada's productivity, unfortunately, it's going to take a while. And the things that we're going to identify as the problems hindering us are just, it doesn't benefit the people that are in power to affect change on them.
Yeah.
Right. But the one thing you should take from this is that the Bank of Canada is going to reduce interest rates so fast and so furiously because there's nothing else. There's nothing else. Without decreasing interest rates, there's no Canadian consumer. And the American consumer is not buying as many Canadian products produced in our factories. So we're going to rely on Canadian services. And those Canadian services, 70% of our economy is Canadian services. Those services need to get gobbled up by the Canadian households and unfortunately the Canadian government. Those are the biggest users of those services. So in order to do that, we have to drop interest rates.
Right.
It's all we got.
We're a one-trick pony.
So you can count on significantly lower interest rates from the Bank of Canada. Tiff Macklin acting like he's surprised that the Canadian monetary policy got more traction. Bullshit. For sure, there's no new normal. The new normal is just the actual normal, the real normal, the same normal it's always been. Reversion back to the mean, which is lower interest rates in order to pump along in this bullshit productivity metrics we found ourselves in. Okay. And the other thing you can count on now, because there is a diversion between Canada and the United States, is you can count on a much weaker Canadian dollar.
Right.
You're not going to be spending as much money when you go places.
Yeah.
Because the Canadian dollar will get weaker relative to the United States dollar. All right. Productivity. Okay. So what is productivity hurt by? Productivity is hurt by oligopolies. When you have oligopolies, so number one thing, when you have a country that has a whole bunch of oligopolies, you might as well act like a state-run enterprise, right? You have no choice. You're going to be utilizing those services. Those services will cost what they cost. Those goods will cost what they cost, and you will be happy to take them on. There will be very little innovation. There will be very little working towards the research and development of making that industry better. I'm going to give you an example. I call upon these examples because it's the industry that we work in, okay? Open banking doesn't have a fucking shot in Canada. Open banking would mean that Canadians would be able to view all of their accounts and all of their mortgages and all of their assets on a platform, similar to the borrower portal we created. But the banks will not allow integration into their platforms to offer all of the data to the consumer in one place. Because if we did that, they would have to compete, and they don't want to have to compete. Amongst themselves, they would prefer everybody keep their slice of the market and then just juice the margins a little bit. It doesn't work for them. And that's why open banking is going to have a real big uphill battle. And what's the consequence of that? So an oligopoly is affecting productivity. How are they affecting productivity? Because the companies that create innovation within open banking, the tech companies that are going to be leaders in the world, will never originate in Canada.
Right.
Because it's not a fertile ground for it. They're going to originate in the United States. They're going to originate in Ireland. Ireland, by the way, number one on that list. Congratulations, Ireland. This bullshit little country. All they had is potatoes. No, Guinness. But seriously, they got, what do they have? It's Guinness. Guinness and potatoes. Yeah. But they're smart and they offer tax incentives and they bring really big, bright companies into that country. I think it was like the headquarters for like for tax reasons for like Amazon and Apple and like airplane leasing. And like there's so many stimulative measures introduced by that regime that have led to that country dominating in productivity that they should be commended. Not so much here. Okay. So the oligopolies are going to stymie innovation. Okay. They're going to stop research and development and they're going to be complacent in how they deal with the consumer.
Right.
Oligopolies number one. And you know what? Thankfully, Canada just has an oligopoly everywhere you turn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, how's that even possible? I don't know, but there's lots of them. Okay. Number two, regulations. Regulations prevent companies from operating efficiently. I'm not saying like get rid of all of the regulations and just make it a free-for-all. I am saying dial back regulations that make no sense. It is widely accepted that a lot of the regulatory measures and oversight that different industries are subjected to are nonsense. Industries know it. Everyone's afraid to call it out, but all of those regulatory requirements make it cumbersome for smaller companies to operate. And unfortunately, this is not being a conspiracy theorist, but unfortunately, that's the playbook for oligopolies. Oligopolies, and you're going to fault them for it? In order to maintain their oligopoly, the last thing they want is somebody to come in on their barrier to entry, right? Oligopolies are structured that way. Once you create an oligopoly, you have a barrier to entry and you prevent everybody, you have basically a
moat.
Big wall and a moat. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And dragons and alligators and like whatever you can put in there.
Yeah.
Well, think of regulators as that dragons and the alligators, right? Making it harder for anyone to scale that wall, to get close to that wall, to challenge that dominance using innovation. Unfortunately, it's those small enterprises that are doing their best to create innovative ways to challenge that we need in order for our country to become more productive.
Right.
That's the only way it works. And by stymieing them with regulation, we're further hindering that development. Okay. Number three, this is like a no-brainer and it's going to frustrate everybody. Infrastructure, healthcare, transportation, like the roads. Mm-hmm. Doug Ford said he wanted to buy the 407. He wanted to put a tunnel under the 401. Don't look at that and say like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Look at that and say, it's a talking point for Doug Ford because people are pissed.
Yeah.
Right? Unfortunately, on a municipal level, we take things like the Gardiner for granted, right? Where like city council can just say like, oh, we're going to just shut the Gardiner for 3 years. Like we're going to make it 2 lanes.
Yeah.
And, a 2-kilometer commute on the Gardiner for about 4 hours or 5 hours out of every single day is just going to take 30 to 45 minutes. And you know what? There's going to be no impact. You know where the impact is? It's on productivity.
Right.
All of these things that we take for granted at a municipal, provincial, federal level, there should be like a productivity task force tasked with this. That's our hair is on fire right now.
Right.
Okay. The problem is you're going to have a task force. It's going to make a lot of sense for whether it's conservative or liberal for someone to come in and challenge oligopolies and reduce regulation and increase spending on infrastructure. Like, it's not going to happen. It's you're not going to get elected on that platform because the vested interest is the massive political lobbying groups don't want that to happen.
Right.
The problem is, and what these oligopolies are finding out now is that when the host becomes weak and starts dying, the parasitic leech no longer can live, right? So like think of Canada and the Canadian economy as the host, and oligopolies are the fucking leech. They prevent the host from becoming healthier and growing and competing. And they're very happy to do so because that's the relationship. It's not a symbiotic relationship.
Right.
It's a very one-way relationship. And eventually the host dies unless something can be done to stop it. So infrastructure, like the other thing, like infrastructure. Okay, so like our healthcare sucks. When my dad was dying, it would take, like we couldn't even go to the emergency room because you'd call the emergency room or you call the doctor. They say, you go to the emergency room, it's like 24 hours before you can see somebody. Okay. My dad, who worked 40 years, paid millions of dollars in taxes. Anyways, the transportation system, our subways.
Totally
subways.
Terrible. Yeah, the worst.
And then like compare that against the Canadians pay more taxes than almost any other country in the world. So what's going on there?
This is depressing.
Finally, education and training. Okay. Education and training. The more skilled and competent your workforce is, the more able they're going to be to produce.
Right.
So equipping them with skills and education is amazing. But immigration, when you bring in unskilled workers, you're starting at a disadvantage. So you already have poor infrastructure, poor education setup, poor training, poor skills training, but now you're inputting a raw material into that, unskilled workers that require more in order to thrive. Like if we had an amazing training ground for people that could turn unskilled workers into skilled workers. I don't know how. Like I'm not going to dive into that, but if we had that, then you could make an argument for the rapid population growth that we see. But we don't have that.
Right.
We don't even have infrastructure that can support our existing population. So there's this continued diminishing productivity. Okay, you want to compare? Okay, we're not even going to compare against China. China's got a 5% target growth rate for the country, and the government sets it. And if they don't hit 5%, I'm sure people die.
For sure, people die.
Yeah. Let's just compare it to the US. It's a good benchmark. Between 2009 and 2019, and honestly, I'm almost done. So like, if you've stuck with us this far, you could do it. Okay, between 2009 and 2019, the United States grew by 27%, 10 years. Canada grew by 25%. Not bad. Neck and neck. Although towards the end of that, the last 5 or 6 years, Canada started falling off a cliff. We were more neck and neck at the beginning. We used to be, in 2009, richer than Montana. So the United States is broken up into like have and have not states, right? Mm-hmm. Montana is right up there. As far as a good state that has production that, contributes to the federal system. Alabama, not so much. It's a have not. Canada is now less productive than Alabama. We went from being better than Montana to worse than Alabama.
Worse than the worst.
Yeah. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. But you have to think of Canada as providing for the United States. 40% of everything that's produced in our factories gets sold into the United States. What do you think is going to happen when if a president comes into power in the United States with an affinity for tariffs?
Right.
That says, I'm going to tariff everything 20%. What do you think is going to happen? It will impact that ability that Canada has to sell 40% of our goods into the United States. We're already being faced with, we're going to have a huge unemployment problem because of the construction industry, which we rely on way too heavily. It's all we got. Now we're going to affect manufacturing because our goods will not be sold as frequently into the United States. And we will fall back on our service sector, which accounts for 70% of our economy. And who will be there to absorb the output of our service sector? Households and government. Government spending an ever-increasing portion of their budget on servicing interest. And guess what? So are the households, which is why interest rates are going to drop. Why do I think this happened? This is it. You stuck with us this far. You might as well.
Well, I have one more question after you're done. So there's 2 more things.
Okay. I'm getting right back to it because I know we need to keep your attention till the end here because this is good. I think Trudeau got tricked. And I'm going to explain to you how I think this happened. Listen, I know you well enough now, okay? You like to fit in. I like to fit in.
Yeah,
100%. Everybody wants to fit in, right? But you are still suspicious of people.
Yes.
Right? Like of their motives, where they're coming from. Like I had a very good buddy of mine who I played tennis with this morning, Greg Rysplinski, shout out Greg Rysplinski, who said to me, in business, you kind of have to start off by trusting, but you don't trust with everything. You trust and you hope that trust is validated. And you do that in order to move forward, right? So you get burnt, but you don't trust with everything right away, right? I think becoming a prime minister or like the leader of a government is like you get to join this really exclusive club, especially the G7, right?
Right.
The 7 most powerful economies. By the way, Canada is like, we might not even be invited to the G7 anymore. Who knows how that's going to work?
Right.
If the productivity keeps going the way it is, we'll be in the fucking BRICS soon. The emerging economies that are like rallying against the American dollar. Okay. But I think that what happens is like you get to fly on your country's airplane to go to these big meetings where all these other leaders are flying in on their airplanes and everyone's getting together. By the way, if I was ever going to be like, if there was ever a time that I think you wanted to be doing that, I think it was during the period that Berlusconi was in charge of Italy, was running Italy and going to those meetings. Because if you look up some of the shit this guy did, like it's hilarious.
That was that movie you sent me. There was a movie.
There's a movie about Berlusconi, but like there are things that Berlusconi did that like, it's just like, you think Trump is funny. Berlusconi is like, it was just hilarity. Anyways, so I think like you get excited about it, right? You put on a great suit, you get on your country's airplane, you fly into these meetings, you're meeting with all the most powerful people in the world, you have so many people speaking in your ear, and you probably begin to think you are fucking omnipotent, right? Powerful and untouchable and representing the interests of this entire country. And at a certain point, if you are not strong mentally, it is going to fuck you up. And you are going to enter into negotiations with sharks. And I think Trudeau got tricked. I think he's just a bad negotiator. He doesn't realize who's trying to screw him over. And I think he got tricked. And I think that different governments get tricked to different degrees. I think that there is very much a world economic order. And I think that you can see that puppeted through the finance ministers and the leaders of many of the governments. I think that you can see who the rebels are. Like there's a reason why Turkey's Erdogan uses immigration as a means to extract either revenge or some form of concession from the European Union, right? Like when Erdogan was pumping immigrants into Europe through Greece, that was as a way to negotiate with Germany, right?
Right.
Different countries negotiate in different ways. I think that Trudeau went to some meetings and got sold on oil is bad, decarbonize your economy, don't worry about it, you're developed, everything's going to be fine. Oil's bad. Oil's bad, okay? Oil is also about 20% of our economy.
Right.
And we are probably one of the top 3 oil-rich nations in the world. Forget about Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Canada is where it's at, but we don't refine it because that's dirty. And we don't like pipelines to send it to transport it because that's dirty and that would upset people. Well, all you do, if you have natural assets that you don't utilize, your productivity diminishes because you allow someone else to extract all the value from those resources. Listen, the resources are still going to get used, right? Anyways, I'm not going to go on too much of a tangent on energy, but we have it. We could be very responsible custodians of it. And we could extract greater productivity and revenue from utilizing it properly. But I think we got tricked that it was too dirty and too bad. And you know what? You could be the champion of this and won't you look amazing? And everyone will love you for it. And you know what? They will love you for it at the beginning. But when it starts to impact foreign policy and when it starts to seriously impact Canadians' wallets, you're not going to be viewed favorably.
Right.
This prime minister will go down as probably one of the worst prime ministers Canada's ever had. And it's not because he's liberal. It has nothing to do with being liberal.
Yeah.
It has something to do with being delusional in his abilities and thinking that he could see who was trying to screw him and who wasn't, and he couldn't figure it out. Because he got screwed on this carbon thing, and Canadians are now getting screwed because of it. He got screwed on immigration. For sure, somebody somewhere provided, and then other people reinforced to him the benefits of allowing a lot of people, a lot of unskilled workers into Canada. Listen, economies break when you throw too much at them all at once. We had a lot going on. And we kind of papered over a shitty economy first at the end of the pandemic or during the pandemic by printing money, and then by opening the floodgates of unskilled workers into Canada. And it's it's great. You bring people into Canada, you give them a shot, right? Like, I don't want, like, my parents are immigrants to Canada. In fact, they came in the period of time that is the only period of time proportionately that exceeds the 2024 immigration numbers, which was like 1957. I wrote it down. Yeah, 2024 was the strongest growth since 1957. The difference is that we're not bringing in any skilled workers right now.
Right.
We're bringing in have-nots. We're bringing in people that need help. And we're not doing them any favors because they're entering into our economy
with nothing to show.
Economy sucks. So the unemployment rate's spiking. So if you want to address productivity, you got to start getting into these things. Right. And that was my rant today. If honestly, YouTube has these metrics that you can see, and I want to see if we can beat the amount of time people kind of hold on to these podcasts and listen to them for. One trick I can offer you is the playback speed. Increase the playback speed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Like, I listen to podcasts at 1.5 times because I find a lot of people speak really slowly and like kind of drone on. There's a lot of spaces. Okay. Well, you had a question.
Well, I was going to say, what would you do to fix it? Like, if you were like beamed up into being the prime minister right now, what would you do to fix it?
Listen, I don't think you need to do an immense amount to start off with.
Right.
I think that the herky-jerkiness of everything that we do sucks.
Yeah.
Like, look at everything we do now. You would think that with like this era that we live in, where you have all this heightened access to data, that you'd be able to make more precise movements.
Mm-hmm.
Look at our company, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we track such small items, like the number of phone calls, the number of emails someone sets up, the amount of time it takes to respond to a customer. We could do that on a national, on a federal, on a provincial, on a municipal level, but we don't. And there's no cohesion. But I think that what you need to start doing is the first thing that I would do. Do you remember when COVID started?
Yeah.
What did I say? Do you remember that or no?
I mean, you said a lot of things.
I wish we could pull this one up. But I told you it was such a golden opportunity. We're just going to spend a whole bunch of money.
Right.
We knew it was going to happen. Why don't we spend this money on items that can make us more productive?
I remember this comment now.
Why don't we spend money on giving companies money for research and development to create innovative tools like AI?
Training.
Within AI.
Yeah.
Why don't we create better infrastructure? Why don't we build some hospitals? Of course, I know why.
Didn't China build a hospital?
Yeah.
Like
but you know why we didn't
hours?
build hospitals? Because we've resigned ourselves to how shitty our productivity is.
Right.
And we were like, well, we'll never build a hospital in time.
Right.
But if we could have allocated that capital into infrastructure and into helping productivity at that time, when like $1 trillion just escaped, it was more than $1 trillion. It just escaped. If we could go back in time and use that $1 trillion, honestly, there would have never been a better opportunity to help the Canadian economy become more productive. And like, listen, the reason why this is problematic is because you have to be in government and say, we're going to spend some money and we're going to give tax breaks to innovative companies and we're going to make oligopolies sweat.
Right.
Okay. How many people are you going to piss off?
Right.
Okay. Like, all those oligopolies have massive lobbying groups that are lobbying to get rid of you right away. Like the media, for example, right? The media is subsidized by the federal government. How do you get rid of that?
Right.
Anyways, what would I do? I would start off with trying to find ways to foster innovation. You have to spend some money. You've got to start spending money and you got to start attracting companies and innovations here and fostering them here on our soil. And the way we're doing them the way we do that right now is we write checks for it. Like Stellantis set up a plant here. We wrote them a check for $1 billion. It's more now because they keep balking at the amount and they keep asking for more. And the reason why we have to pay companies to come and set up here is because the productivity sucks. There's many reasons, but mostly it's productivity. In the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, Canada was seen as a really fertile ground for productivity because we had universal healthcare, because our healthcare worked, because we had infrastructure, but the infrastructure and the healthcare, all that infrastructure hasn't grown to where we are. It stayed the same.
Right.
Toronto had 1 million people. Now it has 10 million people and nothing's changed. The subway's still the same.
Yeah.
Hospitals are still the same. Capacity isn't there to service those people, and that makes people less productive.
Right.
So we need to find ways to start stimulating that innovation, or else we're going to be writing checks like the $1 billion we wrote to Stellantis or the $13 billion we wrote to VW last year to get them to come and open up shops here.
Right.
If we were productive, we wouldn't have to do that.
That's wild.
Listen, we're just a stupid mortgage podcast. Okay. So just listen to me on this one thing. Do not take a fixed rate mortgage. They're inflated right now. They're inflated because bond yields are spiking in the United States because everyone thinks Trump is going to come. The market clearly thinks Donald Trump's going to come into power. And when Donald Trump comes into power, he's going to hike tariffs and he's going to bring more domestic activity in the United States. He is going to push for innovation, right? And we will diverge even further, but our interest rates are going to drop. They are going to drop so fast. So we're at prime rates at 5.95 right now.
Yep.
The overnight rate is at 3.75. There's a 220 basis points difference between those two things. The prime rate within 1 year is going to look like the overnight rate does today. There's no other way out.
I can't wait for my mortgage to come up for renewal.
Yeah. And if you have a mortgage, Donald Trump is actually, I'm going to leave you this with one last thing. If you have a mortgage right now, if you have a 5-year fixed rate mortgage with a couple years left, Donald Trump is going to reduce the penalty for you to break that mortgage because bond yields are a little too high right now because of him, because of the prospect of him getting into power. And if he does get into power, they'll probably spike a little bit more. Now, if you want to break that mortgage and go to a variable rate, before variable rate mortgages, remember this, the discount of variable rate mortgages off of prime is going to start shrinking. Prime minus 1 is going to become prime minus 80, is going to become prime minus 60, is going to become prime minus 40. And in worse financial times, it'll go to prime plus 1.
Right.
So lock in the variable rate and pay a smaller penalty because the interest rate differential penalty on your existing mortgage is impacted by the prevailing 5-year fixed rates, which are impacted by bond yields. And I am sorry we had to have this conversation about productivity today, but it was necessary. And until next week, when we release another podcast for you, I want to remind you not to subscribe to this podcast. No, seriously, you could subscribe. You could, if you really want to, you can subscribe and you can like it and you can send it to people. But I do want to thank you because our podcast is one of the fastest growing economic podcasts on Spotify right now. And that is cool.
Interesting.
So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Justin.
Anytime. Happy to be here.
In the meantime, try to be a little more productive.
Yeah. Be more productive. Thank you.